All right, today we're going to dive into a foundational moment in American history that you probably didn't learn about in school. We're re-examining the very beginning of Spanish New Mexico. And it's a story that's really less about glorious conquest and, well, a whole lot more about spectacular failure and incredible resilience.
So let's just kick things off with a simple question. When was New Mexico really founded? Now, you might have a date in your head, but I'm telling you, the real story is so much more complicated and honestly, way more interesting than the official version.
Okay, so the date you almost always hear. It's 1598. That's the year Don Juan de Oñate led his expedition north to establish a new colony. This is the big milestone, right? The one that gets put on plaques and in the textbooks. But, as we're going to see today, that date, it's more like a false start, not the real founding. So, why is 1598 such a shaky foundation? Well, you've got to understand what the Oñate expedition actually was. This wasn't some huge project by the Spanish government. Nope. This was a privately funded deal. Think of it like a high-stakes startup, bankrolled by Oñate himself. And the whole thing was driven by one big hope, finding gold and silver. And you know what? Right from the get-go, there were huge problems. The expedition was supposed to get moving fast, but it got stuck for 2 whole years. Royal officials in Mexico City kept hitting the brakes, raising concerns about Oñate's money, his management skills, whether he could actually pull this thing off. It was just this total on-again, off-again mess. And all those delays, they had a massive impact on morale. Oñate was contractually required to bring at least 200 soldiers. He did recruit that many, but after 2 years of just sitting around, a lot of them just gave up and went home. So by the time they finally got going, he was down to just 128 men. I mean, he was already failing to meet his end of the bargain. Now, on paper, this whole mission had some really noble goals. The Spanish crown had this very clear policy, based on decades of, let's say, messy colonization experiences. They told Oñate to treat the native peoples with peace, with friendship, with good Christian principles. The idea was that it was all going to be this gentle, orderly process.
Yeah, the reality on the ground, it was the complete opposite. So the crown says bring enough food. What happens? They run out before they even get to what we now call New Mexico. The crown says be friends with the natives. Well, they immediately became a burden, desperately needing food from the Pueblo peoples, and sometimes taking it by force. And the main goal, finding all those riches, they found absolutely nothing.
And this quote right here from a settler back in 1601, wow, it just captures the sheer desperation. You can feel the pain in those words. You have to understand, this wasn't just some failed mission, it was a full-blown humanitarian crisis. The Spanish settlers were starving, and that led to horrible conflicts like the infamous tragedy at Acoma Pueblo, which was sparked by soldiers demanding food that the Pueblo people just didn't have.
All right, on to part 2, the ashes of a private enterprise. This is where Oñate's big startup didn't just stumble, it totally collapsed. I mean, it turned into an absolute personal and financial disaster. So get this, by 1607, Oñate had poured his entire family fortune into this thing. We're talking the equivalent of $20 million today, just gone. Hopeless, totally bankrupt, he resigned. His whole dream of building a private kingdom, it just evaporated in the high desert.
And here's the really crucial point. By 1608, the Spanish government had just seen enough. The viceroy looked at all the reports, starvation, conflict, zero profit, and he made his recommendation: abandon New Mexico. The verdict was in. The entire project was a failure, and the official order was to pack up and leave.
And then, right at this moment, when it's all about to be over, everything changes. Just as the colony was about to get completely snuffed out, a Franciscan friar, the very same guy who had just reported how awful things were, he goes back to Mexico City with this shocking new claim. 7,000 Pueblo people had suddenly been baptized. Now, was that number real? Who knows? But you know what? It worked. The crown completely reversed its decision, convinced it just couldn't abandon thousands of new Christian souls.
And that brings us to Section 3, 1609, a different kind of founding. Because this is the year, this is the moment we should really be talking about as the beginning of Spanish New Mexico. What came out of the ashes of that failure was something brand new. You see, this refounding in 1609 was completely different. It was no longer a private venture chasing profits. It was now a royal mission, supported by the government. The main goal wasn't about gold anymore. It was about evangelization. And it was built on this new, pretty fragile idea of coexistence and mutual benefit between the remaining Spanish and their Pueblo neighbors. Okay, section 4. And then there were 50. Who were these people who made this new start possible? Well, it wasn't some big army. It was this tiny, incredibly resilient group of people who decided to stay when pretty much everyone else had bailed. And this, to me, is where the story gets really amazing. So, how many? Roughly 50 soldiers and their families. That's it. Just let that sink in for a second. The whole future of Spanish culture in this huge area rested on the shoulders of just a few dozen people who, for whatever reason, faith, friendship, maybe just sheer stubbornness, they decided to stick it out.
And here's what's so incredible to me. This is where history stops being abstract and gets deeply personal. Look at these names: Archuleta, Baca, Griego, Hinahas, Lucero, Martin Serrano, Montoya, Romero. These are the actual last names of those original 50. If you have Hispanic New Mexican heritage, there is a very good chance your family tree goes right back to this tiny group. These are your ancestors.
And we absolutely have to talk about the founding mothers, because they're so often overlooked. The culture that came out of this wasn't just Spanish. No, it was a blend from the very beginning. Women like Doña Inés, an Otomi interpreter, and Beatriz de los Angeles, a Mexicana Indian woman, and so many other native women married Spanish settlers. They became the matriarchs of these founding families, weaving their own heritage and traditions into the very fabric of New Mexico.
All right, Section 5, a legacy of two factions. Now, don't get the idea that this tiny little community was all one big happy family. Oh no. Almost right away, these 50 or so families split into two fiercely opposed political camps. And that division, it would define life in New Mexico for generations.
So what were they fighting about? It was all about who should have the final say, the royal governor or the Franciscan friars. The Baca, Montoya, and Romero families, for example, were big supporters of the friars. On the other side, families like Gomez, Madrid, and Chavez, they sided with the governors. And let me be clear, this wasn't some friendly debate. This was a bitter, nasty, multi-generational feud. They denounced each other to the Inquisition, they had each other arrested, and in some cases, even executed. The political DNA of this new colony was forged in that conflict.
So, at the end of the day, why does any of this matter? Why does shifting one date on a calendar make such a big difference? Because it completely changes the narrative. The real founding of Spanish New Mexico wasn't about a grand conquest. It was a messy, very human story of failure, survival, of cultures blending, and of deep, deep conflict, all carried on the backs of this tiny handful of incredibly determined people.
And that really leaves us with one final thought, doesn't it? This whole story shows how official narratives can sometimes bury a much more complex and, frankly, much more fascinating truth. It just makes you wonder, what other official stories that we all take for granted might be hiding a much more interesting truth?